ESPN.com's best and brightest going around the horn. College football reporter Chris Lowe, college football reporter Andrea Adelson, college football playoff reporter Heather Dinich. College football playoff, by all accounts, was a smashing success in year one. What thought of the powers that be, what thought have they given to expansion?
Well, the ones that matter, and I've talked to almost every conference commissioner this offseason, and there's no desire to expand the playoff. I spoke with Bill Hancock, the executive director of the college football playoff. Nobody is talking about this anytime in the near future, but I think the reality of the situation is we're heading into year two of a 12-year contract, and maybe midway down the road, maybe there starts to be some serious discussion. Gary Patterson at TCU, I tell you, is already pulling for a 6-team conference playoff.
How would that set up?
Well, he would have all five conference champions in, and then an at-large bid. But there's also ideas about shortening the regular season to maybe 10 games. But I don't think anybody wants to do away with conference championship games.
Chris, what's the scenario that could accelerate a process that could get us toward a 6 or 8-team playoff?
For a blue blood to be left out, Alabama, SC, Ohio State, that wins this conference championship, maybe in a year when everyone in that conference beats up on everybody and they lose 2 games, but they get left out because everybody else in other conferences have no losses or 1 loss. To me, that's the quickest way to get from 4 to 8.
If you're the SEC, and let's say you go a couple of years where you don't have a representative because the league is cannibalizing itself. Given the power that league holds in college football, is that a scenario which could bring about change?
Does it depend on which SEC school, though? I mean, there are levels of SEC schools, right? I mean, if it's an Alabama that's left out for 2 or 3 years, that's head and shoulders above, let's say, a Mississippi State. Does that mean that there's a bigger push because it's Alabama and people care more about Alabama? I think it really all depends on the school. As Chris mentioned, there are specific blue bloods in the SEC, and then there are some that just aren't the blue bloods of the SEC.
So if we were to go back, if last year in the Big 12, we're talking about Oklahoma and Texas on that end line versus Baylor and TCU, are we looking at a different conversation in the offseason?
We are, and I can tell you that as the coaches came through the car washes at ESPN, I asked almost all of them how much brand matters, and the majority of them, I can tell you, said absolutely. I can sit here and tell you that it doesn't, but that would be a lie. It does. When it comes down to an Alabama or a Kentucky, and the resumes are comparable, Alabama might get the nod, at least in the way that the coaches are seeing it. The selection committee will tell you, no, we're getting the 4 best teams.
Brand absolutely matters. And nobody wants to say that or admit that. Great example. Last year, Mississippi State's ranked 1 there in the poll. Okay, they lose to Alabama by 5 on Alabama's home field. Now, it becomes a moot point because they lose to Ole Miss the last week of the regular season. Had they won that game and been 11-1, only loss on the road to number 1 Alabama, I still think they would have been squeezed out of the playoff. I think Ohio State would have gotten in. Now, had Mississippi State's same resume been Alabama or LSU or Florida, do you think we'd even be having that conversation?
Or what about this one? What if it was not Ohio State that was in the mix to leapfrog TCU and Baylor for the last spot? Let's say it was another middling team from the Big Ten Conference. Would that have changed how that playoff picture would have looked?
Let me tell you a quick story that might build some faith in this system here. I spoke with an assistant SID at Wisconsin who was Barry Alvarez's stats guy, okay? And every Sunday he would sit with Barry Alvarez and prepare his stats for him. And Alvarez liked Mississippi State from week 1. And he said, I like their toughness on the offensive line. I like this veteran group. And throughout the course of the season, guess who was the number 1 team ranked when the selection committee, their first ranking came out? It was Mississippi State. Yep. So Patrick Herb, that's the SID that I was talking with, he was the stats guy. He said that his faith in the system grew over the course of the whole season because he saw not only how diligent Barry was with it, but in listening to Barry say, I come to these meetings and guess what? I'm not the only one prepared with lists and charts and graphs. So there is a feeling within that community of the selection committee inside that room that those guys are truly focusing on hanging up the hats and the biases whether or not you believe it, and apparently a lot of coaches don't.
I'll give Andrea the last word, and this is with Notre Dame. What if it's the Irish that either get in or maybe get left out, and we bring up the conversation of, what happens with these independents, one with the tradition and the luster that the Irish have? What happens if Notre Dame factors into the conversation?
Well, I think people in the ACC would be upset. We've already heard coaches talking about how they believe that get in a conference or you don't belong in the playoff if you're going to be getting the benefit of the doubt there. I still don't know if that's going to be enough to get Notre Dame into a conference, but certainly their schedule is going to play into it, and the name brand. I mean, I love the example, Heather, but I do believe that name brand plays a lot into it, and that's why I think if you're talking about the ACC, right now there's one, maybe two name brands that win on a consistent basis. And so if we're talking about North Carolina being 11-1, I don't think they're getting the benefit of the doubt over maybe an 11-1 team like Ohio State.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting how this plays out. We're still just in year 2 of the college football playoff, and it'll be interesting to watch what variables, what factors can contribute to maybe, potentially, having playoff expansion.